Count Henri Raymond de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfort, to give him his full name and title, was born in 1864, near the rural southern French town Camjac. His family were aristocratic and wealthy and lived in considerable luxury in the Château du Bosc. His mother gave birth to another boy in 1867, but he died only a year later. In the wake of this tragic event, Toulouse-Lautrec's parents separated, and for the next few years he was cared for by a nanny. But when he was 8 years old, he went to live with his mother in Paris. Even in childhood, his talent was obvious, and his mother encouraged his artistic inclinations by arranging some informal tuition with the artist René Princeteau, a friend of his father. And like his tutor, much of Toulouse-Lautrec's early drawings and paintings were equestrian in nature. In 1877, at the age of 13, he fell and fractured his right femur, and in the following year it was the turn of his left. Both ceased to grow as a consequence, while the rest of him progressed into manhood. This was undoubtedly an unfortunate consequence of the centuries of first cousins marrying and having children, including his own parents. But despite this misfortune, he was able to at least carry on indulging his obsession with drawing, and René Princeteau was instrumental in persuading Henri's parents to pay for him to have further training with the respected neoclassicist artist Léon Bonnat at his studio in Montmartre. But Toulouse-Lautrec also spent time in the southern coastal region Céléran, where he created some paintings of local farm and vineyard workers. In 1882, at the age of 18, Toulouse-Lautrec left Bonnat to join other aspiring artists at the studio of Fernand Cormon, and he remained there for the next 5 years while he became increasingly accomplished in his own work. Most of the pictures he was creating at this time were portraits of people he knew or others who were happy to sit for him, and there were quite a few paintings featuring the dancers of the Parisian ballet. By this point he had developed a painted approach not all that distant from the older Edgar Degas, and whether this was why he chose ballet as a favoured subject I don't know, but the similarities were obvious, even if considerably less upbeat. His paintings featured regularly in a series of not particularly successful exhibitions, alongside other similarly minded contemporaries, including Vincent van Gogh, who he counted as a friend and whose work he admired greatly, and Suzanne Valadon, with whom it's rumoured Toulouse-Lautrec had a brief affair, but it isn't actually substantiated. In 1889 he created this now iconic image of a young woman, which not only demonstrated his uncanny ability to faithfully record human anatomy, but also to reflect on the human condition with a manifestly sombre empathy. And in the same year he also produced this equally striking image of one of his female acquaintances, titled The Laundress, and it too was possessed of entirely similar characteristics. It was also in 1889 that the Moulin Rouge cabaret opened, and Toulouse-Lautrec was commissioned to produce his first poster, and this would be the beginning of a mutually beneficial association. He was on such good terms with the management of the cabaret he had his own seat in the theatre permanently reserved, and his paintings and limited edition lithographs were frequently exhibited and sold to the clientele who came to see the shows performed there. And whether creating illustration or art, all his work was now centred on observations of Parisian life, from the bourgeois top down to the murkier bottom, which provided him with all the subject matter he could handle. He had for several years been spending quite a lot of his time and money in the Parisian brothels, and he was even commissioned by one of them to create paintings of their prostitutes to decorate the walls. But his images were not exploitative, and the affinity and empathy he felt for these women was obvious in his depictions. And even though some portrayed the prostitutes' physical affection for each other, it was never shown with any real degree of prurience. It was in 1892 when he first established a working relationship with Artistide Bruant, a well-known entertainer and impresario. This poster was one of several Toulouse-Lautrec designed, and we're fortunate to have the maquette created for client approval, showing the image before transcription as a lithograph. This and others were instrumental in raising Toulouse-Lautrec's profile as a lithographer, and before long he was just as likely to be working as a poster artist and illustrator as he was a painter. where his painted work fit quite comfortably into what is now called the post-impressionist style. His posters and other lithographic work revealed the conspicuous influence of 18th and 19th century Japanese woodblock print masters, and tended towards less obviously representational but highly evocative styling. His images for print, and particularly his posters, typically featured characters who were dominant in the composition, while background elements were more likely to be reduced to simple shapes, frequently with added ink splatter in support. And his use of similarly styled integrated hand lettering was also kept well clear of the essential visual focus. Among other printed work of this period, his poster for the play Le Divan Japonais is now one of his most enduring lithographs. In 1893 he published a limited edition portfolio of monochrome lithographs of various entertainers titled Le Café Concert, also featuring incorporation of ink splatter techniques, and this would be the first of several he would go on to produce. A year later, Jules Renard's Histoire Naturelle was published, and Toulouse-Lautrec contributed many drawings of the various animals featured in the book. They were purely monochrome, some sketchy and others rendered with brush and ink, but all of them demonstrated his ability to capture the essence of the animals without feeling obliged to be slavish in their execution. And the results were more suggestive of animation than other more formally rendered wildlife drawing from this period. He continued to paint more sympathetic images of the prostitutes he considered to be his friends, and painted others which were depictions of more respectable cabaret and theatre scenes, along with portraits of the performers and clientele. And his illustrations were in ever-increasing demand for posters and other graphic outcomes, and by this point were just as likely to be advertising the publication of books and magazines as they were theatrical productions. And the available evidence of Toulouse-Lautrec's output strongly suggests that by the middle of the decade his work came to be dominated by his graphics, even if he didn't actually abandon painting, however prolific he was in print. Among other commissions at this time, he illustrated a book about the singer and entertainer Yvette Gilbert, written by Gustave Geffroy, with a collection of expressive, if surprisingly morose lithographic sketches. It was also in that year he began an association with the humour magazine Le Rire, with this conspicuously more cheerful portrait of Gilbert. Among the many printed commissions he was undertaking at this time, Toulouse-Lautrec added to his theatrical work with illustrated covers for the programmes for the plays for which he was frequently designing the posters. And the torrent of lithographic work he continued to produce, with only the occasional exceptions such as this poster for a Parisian photographer, continued to be related to the cabaret and more respectable theatrical productions, and the performers who were so popular with the city's inhabitants. In 1895 he produced a series of monochrome lithographic drawings for a collection of popular songs written by lyricist Jean Respin and the musician Désir Dehau, as performed in the city's numerous cabarets. This was relatively undemanding work for Toulouse-Lautrec, as there was no requirement to register the colour runs, and he could dash off a typically gestural sketchy impression of the subject of the relevant song very quickly. So the work formed a reliable financial safety net for him at this time. This example of the actual lithographic stone used in the series shows how this process worked at its most basic. At this time, print work, including more for publication in Le Rire, was dominant in his output. His ongoing relationship with the magazine was fairly unexpected, given the magazine's determinedly comic mission. And although it only lasted a few years, he appeared fairly regularly in its pages, with satirical but generally affectionate and far from what might be considered humorous studies of his fellow Parisians, and more portraits of cabaret performers. Because of Toulouse-Lautrec's current global fame, it's easy to forget that at the time he was very much a local Parisian success, whose print runs would only occasionally be in the hundreds, as virtually nothing he created was for even national, let alone international distribution. Having said that, he did spend a little time in England and created a couple of posters for English clients, and there was even an isolated poster produced for the American market. But they were very much the exception that proves the rule, and it would continue to be Parisian clients who would be his virtually exclusive domain. 1896 saw the publication of his portfolio of lithographic depictions of women titled L, some of which were monochrome but most were in colour. They were all serious-minded studies of various females which conspicuously stayed clear of overt sexuality and instead focused on the everyday and mundane, which gave this work more dignity than it might otherwise have possessed if created simply to exploit the female form. And it was also in 1896 that he published an illustrated edition of La Fille Elisa, written by Edmond and Jules de Goncourt, originally a decade earlier. The narrative of the book was particularly grim and concerned a prostitute who murdered a soldier, and unusually Toulouse-Lautrec's images were created as watercolour paintings, reproduced using the full colour offset lithographic process. And for reasons best known to the publisher, they were unfortunately overprinted with text. In 1898 he published another limited edition portfolio of lithographs, all of which were monochrome portraits of the most popular performers of the period, most of which were female. And despite his rapidly deteriorating health and alcoholism, in the same year he also illustrated the book At the Foot of Sinai, written by Georges Clemenceau, the future Prime Minister of France during the Great War. And once again his grainy lithographically drawn images were nobody's idea of light-hearted in tone or execution, and were consequently ideally matched with the tone of the written narrative. But by 1899 Lautrec's chronic alcoholism and frequent bouts of delirium had got considerably worse, and following a severe nervous collapse his family felt obliged to have him committed to a sanitarium. He was there for 3 months, and during that time he created a series of drawings in colour which were later published as a collection of lithographs titled The Circus. There were dozens in the series, and unsurprisingly there was an intense brooding sadness about these images, which appear to have been created from rehearsal sessions, as there is no audience and all images seem to be in natural light. I find myself wondering if he was allowed out from his confinement to visit a passing circus, but I found no confirmation of this. Nevertheless, I find it hard to accept that they might have been the product purely of his imagination. Either way, they were depressingly revealing of his general state of mind and worldview. In 1900, Toulouse-Lautrec returned to the design of theatrical posters, and however poor his mental and physical health, it had manifestly not adversely affected the quality of his designs. And equally surprisingly, there was a late flourishing of limited edition art lithography, including this Degas-influenced print of a jockey and horse in both monochrome and colour, and there was an equally surprising final series of painted work produced, most of it in the form of portraiture, which also compared favourably with similar work from earlier in his career, when his mind and body had been in better shape. But in 1901, having created this, his final poster design, alcoholism and syphilis inevitably got the better of him, and Toulouse-Lautrec died at his mother's chateau at just 36 years old. In a career which had endured for less than 2 decades, Lautrec had produced around 700 oil paintings, more than 250 watercolours, in excess of 350 prints and posters, and somewhere in the region of 5,000 drawings. In an attempt to be as comprehensive as possible in the making of this video, I accessed around 10 different books on the subject of the life and work of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and only 4 of them contain any examples of his printed work whatsoever. And even if I find myself in the highly unusual position of preferring his art to his graphics, this just serves to confirm my antipathy for the art establishment and the critics and historians who inhabit it. But despite my own indifference to much of his illustrated work, only an imbecile wouldn't recognise its crucial role in speeding the evolution of illustration into more imaginative and graphically distinctive territory, and his enduring influence cannot be overstated. Following his death, his mother and the art dealer Maurice Joyant continued to promote his work and helped to fund the establishment of the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum in the town of Albi, which now owns and displays the largest collection of his work. I've never been there and probably never will, but I can't help wondering how much of his illustration work is on display. Sadly, I suspect I know the answer.